Most people saw this as a tragedy, a story about tariffs, job losses, and a dying industry. They were told it was a simple trade dispute, a political squabble between nations. They were told it was an unfortunate but isolated incident. They were wrong. This isn't the end of a story. It's the beginning of ours. The collapse of Canada's lumber giants wasn't the crisis. It was the symptom. It was the first domino pushed in a line that stretches across the entire Canadian economy, from the forests of the West Coast to the oil fields of the prairies, and on to the farmlands that feed the nation. What if I told you the blueprint that took down the lumber industry is now being applied, piece by piece, to everything else that makes Canada a resource superpower? Everyone is focusing on the wrong question. They're asking, why did the lumber industry fall? It's a question that invites simple political answers. The correct question, the strategic question, is, was this a test? A test to see how a G7 nation would react when one of its foundational pillars was systematically targeted. A test of its political will, its economic resilience, and its national coherence. In this analysis, we will not mourn the lumber crisis. We will dissect it. We will treat it as an economic crime scene. For the next 15 minutes, we will decode the blueprint used to dismantle it. And I will prove to you, with data, that this exact blueprint is now being deployed to weaken Canada's energy sector, its agricultural heartland, and ultimately its economic sovereignty. For 30 years, I have analyzed economic patterns for governments and corporations. I've seen this playbook run before in other countries. What I see in Canada today is a classic case of a slow-motion demolition. The evidence is all there, hiding in plain sight for anyone willing to look past the headlines. This isn't a political issue. It isn't about left versus right. It's a structural one, and the clock is ticking. The symptom, deconstructing the lumber blueprint. To understand the pattern that threatens Canada's entire economy, we must first understand the weapon that was tested on its lumber industry. The weapon wasn't just a tariff, it was far more sophisticated, a three-pronged attack designed to cripple and isolate. Let's look at the facts. The first prong of the attack is always external pressure. The United States Commerce Department imposed what are known as countervailing and anti-dumping duties on Canadian softwood lumber. This sounds complicated, but the goal was simple: make Canadian wood too expensive to sell. At their peak, the combined rate climbed to over 20%. Now, for a high-volume, slim-margin industry like softwood lumber, a 20% tax isn't a nuisance. It's a death sentence. It's designed to bleed a company out slowly and painfully, quarter by quarter. According to reports from Global Affairs Canada and industry associations at the time, this immediately made Canadian products uncompetitive in their single largest market. But this external pressure was only the first step. A healthy nation can withstand an external shock. The blueprint's success depends on the second, and arguably most critical, prong: internal neglect. While the lumber industry was being systematically choked, where was Ottawa's focus? The public record, the statements from officials, the parliamentary debates, they are all clear. The government's political capital, its negotiating energy, was almost entirely consumed by the fight over American tariffs on Canadian steel and aluminum under Section 232. The steel crisis was presented as a national emergency. Now let's apply some strategic analysis. Let's look at the numbers from Statistics Canada. At the time, the forestry sector was the lifeblood for nearly 300 communities across the country. It provided hundreds of thousands of direct, high-paying jobs, primarily in rural areas. It was, by any objective measure, a larger and more geographically diverse pillar of the Canadian economy than steel. Yet while Ottawa fought a very public, very loud war for steelworkers, the lumber industry received assurances, committees, and promises. They were told to be patient. They were told to hold on. This disparity in attention wasn't an oversight. It was a strategic choice that revealed a critical flaw in the system: the tendency to react to the loudest crisis, not necessarily the most significant one. This created the perfect environment for the external pressure to do its work, unhindered. With the industry under attack from the outside and neglected from the inside, the final prong of the blueprint could be executed. Narrative isolation. The media, both domestic and international, instinctively frame this as a British Columbia problem, a regional dispute between loggers and environmentalists, or a complex spat over stumpage fees. This narrative was incredibly effective. It effectively cut the industry off from national sympathy and a sense of shared crisis. For someone in Toronto or Calgary, it didn't feel like an attack on Canada's national economic security. It felt like a distant technical issue happening out there in the forests. This isolation is the final nail in the coffin. A company like Gorman Brothers, a family-owned business running for over 75 years, doesn't just fail because of a tariff. It fails when it's left to fight a global trade war on its own. It fails when its own government is looking the other way. It fails when the rest of the country is told that its problems aren't their problems. So let's summarize the blueprint, the weapon that was tested and proven effective. Step 1. Apply targeted, crippling external pressure on a single, vital industry. Step 2. Rely on internal neglect, as the nation's political attention is inevitably diverted to other, seemingly more urgent fires. Step 3. Achieve narrative isolation, framing a national security problem as a mere regional issue. This three-step process doesn't just weaken an industry, it demoralizes it, it dismantles it. Remember this blueprint. You are about to see it again. The disease, the pattern spreads. The second domino in the line is Canada's energy sector, and the exact same three-step blueprint is being deployed, not with tariffs, but with a far more subtle and patient set of weapons. Let's begin with step 1, external pressure. For the energy sector, the pressure didn't come from attacks at the border. It came from landlocking the product. The most potent example is the cancellation of the Keystone XL pipeline. From a purely strategic perspective, this decision was a masterstroke against Canadian economic interests. It wasn't just about one pipeline. It was a clear signal sent to global investors. Your capital is not safe here. Canadian energy has no reliable future path to market. This action, taken by Canada's closest ally, achieved the same outcome as the lumber tariffs. It crippled the industry's ability to compete and grow. At the same time, a well-funded international campaign worked to rebrand Canadian oil as dirty oil, creating immense reputational pressure and driving away environmentally conscious investment funds. This was the external attack. But just like with lumber, it could only succeed because of step 2, internal neglect, and in this case, active internal hindrance. While the U.S. was blocking pipelines from the outside, Canada's own federal policies were creating a labyrinth of regulatory hurdles from within. Consider federal legislation like Bill C-69, what critics dubbed the No More Pipelines Bill. This act overhauled the assessment process for major projects, adding years of uncertainty and millions in costs. It created a climate where building new energy infrastructure became nearly impossible. This is the internal component, a federal government creating policies that actively work against the economic interests of one of its most important industries. The result? A catastrophic decline in investment. Data from the Canadian Association of Petroleum Producers shows that in the last decade, global foreign direct investment in Canadian oil and gas has plummeted. Capital that once flowed into Calgary now goes to Texas, Norway, or Guyana. The investors saw the pattern: external roadblocks, internal hurdles. The blueprint was clear. Finally, step 3, narrative isolation. The debate was expertly framed as Alberta versus the environment, or oil jobs versus a clean future. This narrative successfully painted the entire Canadian energy sector, responsible for hundreds of thousands of jobs and a massive portion of the nation's GDP, as a rogue, environmentally hostile province. The struggle of an oil worker in Fort McMurray was not presented as a Canadian struggle. It was presented as an Alberta problem. The blueprint is identical: external pressure, internal neglect, narrative isolation. The result is the same: a foundational industry weakened, demoralized, and cut off from the rest of the country. But the pattern doesn't stop there. The third domino is now beginning to wobble: agriculture. The pressure here is more subtle, but the blueprint is unmistakable. The external pressure isn't a single tariff. It's a collection of sophisticated non-tariff barriers. And it's the European Union's stringent regulations on genetically modified organisms, which effectively close off markets to Canadian canola. It's India's sudden politically motivated restrictions on lentil imports. It's 1,000 small cuts from trading partners around the world who see a nation unwilling to fight for its industries. And this pressure is effective because of the internal neglect. The most significant internal pressure point is the federal government's target to reduce emissions from fertilizer by 30%. Now, on the surface, this sounds like an environmental policy, but to a farmer in Saskatchewan or Manitoba, it's an economic policy that puts them at a crippling disadvantage. Leaders of groups like the Western Canadian Wheat Growers Association have stated in no uncertain terms that this policy, if fully implemented, will reduce crop yields, dramatically increase food costs, and make Canadian farmers uncompetitive on the global stage. It's the same pattern. A federal policy that undermines a key provincial industry, creating internal division and weakening the whole. This is the internal neglect. Finally, the narrative isolation. When farmers convoyed to Ottawa to protest these policies, how was it framed? Not as a national debate on food security and economic viability. It was framed as a niche issue, driven by a discontented minority. The concerns of the people who feed the nation were marginalized. Their struggle was not a Canadian struggle. It was a farmer's problem. Lumber, energy, agriculture, 3 different industries, 3 different sets of problems, one single repeating blueprint. The domino effect, the economic endgame. This is the point in the analysis where we move from observing the past to forecasting the future. This is not speculation. This is pattern recognition. When you deliberately weaken the foundational pillars of a resource-based economy, the entire structure begins to lose its integrity. Think of Canada's economy as a Jenga tower. The service sector, the tech hubs in Toronto, the financial district in Vancouver, they all rest on the foundation of the wealth generated by the nation's natural resources. You cannot systematically remove these foundational blocks and expect the tower to remain standing. This erosion of the base leads to the most dangerous phase of the process, the loss of economic sovereignty. A nation's ability to negotiate on the world stage, to set its own terms, to resist foreign pressure is directly proportional to the strength of its core industries. A nation that cannot protect its own lumberjacks, oil workers, and farmers is not seen as a partner by the rest of the world. It's seen as a target. Its negotiating position is compromised. It becomes a price taker, not a price setter. This is the inevitable consequence of dependence. As Canada's domestic industries weaken, its reliance on the United States and other global powers deepens. It loses the leverage to say no. And this brings us to the endgame, the final domino. The ultimate objective of this blueprint, whether intentional or not, is not just to weaken these industries. It's to acquire them. History is filled with examples. When a nation's core assets are devalued and its industries are in crisis, foreign capital, often from state-owned enterprises, sweeps in to buy those assets at a discount. The playbook is clear. The pattern has been established. After lumber, after energy, after agriculture, the next sectors in line for this blueprint are Canada's critical minerals. The lithium, the cobalt, the nickel essential for the new green economy, and perhaps eventually its freshwater reserves. The external pressure will come in the form of international climate accords and treaties. The internal neglect will come as governments prioritize other sectors. The narrative isolation will frame it as a remote issue happening in the far north. The blueprint will be the same. The result will be the same. A slow, methodical transfer of control over Canada's sovereign wealth. This is no longer about jobs in one sector. This is about the economic sovereignty of a G7 nation. This is the final, predictable step in the domino effect. Conclusion and resonance point. So, where does this leave us? The demise of Canada's lumber industry was never the real story. It was a stress test. A test of the nation's economic immune system. A test that, by all objective measures, Canada failed. And that failure has now triggered a predictable domino effect. A systemic collapse that is eroding the very foundation of the Canadian economy. This analysis is not an indictment of any single politician or political party. They are symptoms of a deeper structural problem. The problem is a national failure to recognize that protecting its core resource industries is not a regional favor, but a matter of national security. It is a failure to understand that in the game of global economics, you are either a player or you are the board itself. It is critical for Canadians and their allies to understand this pattern, not as a political issue, but as a structural one. Recognizing the blueprint is the first step toward breaking it. And while today we focused on the overall pattern, the next domino, Canada's oil sector, is already showing the exact same warning signs and is facing pressures even greater than the lumber industry did. We'll be breaking that down in our next video, so make sure you're subscribed. But for now, we must confront the conclusion that the data presents. Look at the evidence. Acknowledge the pattern. The critical question isn't if another Canadian industry will fall, but which one is next. Let me know your thoughts in the comments below.